All right, Proffitt podcast listeners, I'm so excited about today's guest. Welcome to the show, Karen. How are you today?
Hi there. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm great.
Yes, we were kind of chatting before we started talking, and I really love the topic that you have chosen for your podcast and your content, and really specifically the audience you serve. So, can you tell everybody what it is that you do? Like, I just want to start right at the top and just call out very specifically the audience that you serve, because I think, from my perspective, being a woman, I think that this is an underrepresented community that we have that can really benefit from your message. So can you share a little bit about that?
Sure. So I was certified. I'm going to take you back a little bit, and I'll keep it short and sweet. I was certified as a health coach back in 2012, and I wrote a healthy lifestyle blog for years. And then I turned 48, and all of the healthy things that I was doing no longer were working. I was exhausted, and now I realized I was in the early stages of perimenopause. I was also going through a divorce. So I was in this, physical and emotional time of change. And it really put me in a position where I had to rethink everything that I had learned before. And I had to learn, I took some advanced certifications in women's wellness. And I really, within a short period of time, kind of turned things around for myself. And during this time, I was also consuming a lot of podcasts. So I had always loved blogging. That was really when I got turned on to podcasts. And what I loved the most about them is that, I could consume them while I was doing other things. So as my life was getting busier and time was becoming more scarce, I could listen in the car, I could listen on a walk, I could listen while I cooked. So I was just really falling in love with the whole medium of podcasting. When I decided to kind of revamp my business, I kind of realized that there aren't a lot of voices for this demographic, at least not voices that have a really empowering message. And I knew this firsthand because when I would go to doctors, I would hear a lot of things like, well, you're over 40, or, well, this is what happens in perimenopause. Like, I kind of got to the point where I decided that if I couldn't find the expert I needed, that I needed to become that expert. And then I just began to see how desperate women were for this kind of information. So I decided, as I said, to kind of revamp my business. And I decided I wanted to start a podcast instead of continuing with my blogging, because I just felt like, there was something very personal about hearing somebody's voice. There was a little more of a connection for me than when I would read somebody's blog. And I just was enjoying sharing what I was learning. So that's really kind of how the podcast came to be. And so, my approach, I'm certified as a health coach and a life coach. So my approach is kind of a unique blend of both. So what that means in terms of my podcast is that sometimes I have topics that are very health driven, health related, like, how to stop overeating, or, which supplements do I really need over 40? So I have those topics, which are definitely more health related. And then I've also got topics that deal with a lot of mindset and thought work. And the two pieces together, I think, are really what this group of women over 40 seem to be resonating with, the idea that I have podcasts on style, I have podcasts on beauty, it's kind of like all the things that I myself as a woman over 40 am thinking about and interested in and sort of managing.
I love this. I love this so much because again, it's like you are your audience, but you're also like, okay, I know this listener, I know this audience, like this is me, like this is the thing. And I love that you said that you went looking for an expert and you realized like, it's not out there. Like, I need to be this person because there has to be other people looking for this type of content and this type of information. So I'm curious, because you were a blogger before, because I've had a lot of people ask me, I did this myself. I was blogging and then I got into podcasting. how much of your audience for blogging transitioned with you into a podcast? Like, was it a seamless transition? Were people excited? Or was it like, okay, I started this new thing and people weren't as receptive? Like, can you like walk us through what that looked like for you?
I don't exactly know because I did take some time off in between. So I could probably answer that question more accurately if I had gone, right from blogging into podcasting. Right. But it really took me a little bit of time, and I kind of shut the blog down and then really took time to, as I said, go through some advanced certifications, get really clear on what my new business was going to be, went through life coach training. So, unfortunately, I can't really answer it because there was that gap in between.
Yeah. Yeah. No, but that's great. And the reason why I really wanted to bring this up is because I think that people are people listening, right? I'm calling you out, listener. If you're sitting there saying, well, I tried this one type of content for me a long time ago and it didn't work, therefore I shouldn't try another type. Like, I will have people come to me all the time and say, I tried YouTube. I was awful at video and it just didn't work for me. I tried this one thing one time and it didn't work for me. So I guess an adjustment to that question is, how did it feel going from blogging and writing? Because we talked about earlier, like you're more of an introvert and I'm very extroverted. So I'm curious, how was that transition for you from, blogging can be a solo only endeavor. You don't have to interact with anybody. You can do your own thing and you can answer comments and do that type of stuff. But what was that transition like once you finally made it?
For me, it was, I felt much more vulnerable podcasting than I ever did blogging. I think there is something about it. It felt a little bit like there was this invisible layer between me and my blog readers. And with the podcast, it really feels like that is kind of stripped away. So, as somebody who does tend to be a little more introverted, who, kind of shied away from social media and video and all of those things, that was kind of a part of this steep learning curve that I managed. I think what was helping is that, as I said, I just love listening to blogs so much that I think that was really motivating me listening to podcasts so much. So I think that was really motivating me to do one myself, because I always felt very connected to whomever I was listening to. And I really wanted to develop a community and have that kind of connection with my listeners. So, it made it a little bit easier to dip my toe in and kind of step outside of my comfort zone, to do it. But it definitely was outside my comfort zone, no question.
Okay. I love that you say, you're sitting there like you've been an active podcast listener for many years before you ever started a podcast. So I'm curious because I did this myself. I loved podcasts. I got to where I was listening to hours and hours whenever I was staying at home with my kids and I was doing stuff around the house and I'd work out. And I got addicted. I was obsessed when I found podcasts. I'm like, oh my gosh, I can learn all these incredible things. So I went through this period where I was consciously or unconsciously, I just saying, oh, I like this episode or I like that interview, but I would have done it this way. Or I would have, this is I listened to this one and I can't listen to it anymore. I can't stand it because of X, Y, and Z. So by the time you got ready to jump all in with your podcast, had you already scripted out your first few episodes in your head, or had you already decided this is exactly how I want my show to be formatted? Or is it something that you kind of just had to stumble through when you were going through the process?
I stumbled through it, but here's where I think blogging really helped me. When I was blogging, I got used to outlining topics and breaking topics down and organizing my ideas. And I think that's really helped me with the podcasting, because while I don't ever go into it with, everything scripted word for word, I do like to sort of organize my thoughts into an outline. And a lot of times it'll be, sometimes it'll be in a list format. I think that that's maybe where the blogging skills kind of crossed over. I do think it's helped me to be a little more clear and a little more organized in what I'm saying. The fact that I had that experience with laying things out.
Okay, this is so helpful because I think that my approach was the exact opposite. So this is why I'm so glad to hear. And this is what I was telling Karen before we started recording. I was like, I love having different perspectives on the show because it really broadens the lens for everybody that's listening and has a different approach than what I typically teach or other people that have come on the show. And so I really appreciate you saying that because in the beginning for me, it was so hard to outline the thing because I did not want to sound scripted, but I didn't want to have too loose of an outline or too much. Like it was this weird balance that it took me a long time. Like I would say up until about 20 episodes in, because I just kind of stumbled through it. And then of course, now today it's second nature and it's a lot simpler. So for anybody that's listening and you're just getting started, there's no right or wrong way to do it. I always say there's no rules with podcasting. You kind of figure out some guidelines and what you can do. But thank you so much for sharing your perspective, because I think that someone's listening and they're like, oh my gosh, I didn't even think about, taking these other skills that I already have and transferring them into a podcast.
And it probably plays a little bit into what you were talking about, the introvert extrovert, right? It was probably easier for you to sit down with a mic and just sort of freestyle than it was for me as somebody who was a little bit shyer in front of the mic. So, I think that's also probably a good entry point for someone who may be introverted to just have the comfort of that guide, that outline, kind of guiding them.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm curious too, now that, since you brought that up about because you're 30 episodes, like as of us recording this, like you just released your 30th episode, like congratulations.
Thank you.
I think it's always fun to celebrate, like whether it's your first, your 30th, your 300th, 3000, like it's so much fun because you're still in the game and you're still going. And I think that is part of the secret to podcasting is just staying in the game and continuing to learn new things and to keep going. But I'm curious because you said, having, being introverted and a little bit shyer behind the mic. What does, I guess, episode 1 versus episode 30 look like for you? Is it easier to sit down behind the mic, or is it still sometimes a struggle and then you get into it and you kind of hit that flow state?
It's definitely easier now. In fact, I was joking that the 30th episode, I decided to sort of honor it by discussing 30 lessons that midlife taught me. And it is by far the most personal and the most vulnerable that I've been in an episode. Up until now, as I said, it was sometimes health related or style or this or that. But, this was really peeling back on like, okay, since I turned 40, I went through a divorce. I started a new business venture. Like there was a lot of change. And so I could never have done that episode 1. I wouldn't have been able to open up that way. So I think that was, maybe the biggest thing that I noticed, just that a little bit more comfort with just getting vulnerable with my listeners. But it's funny because I haven't like looked at the stats for that episode yet, but I think that's what listeners really enjoy. I know it's what I enjoy when I'm listening to a podcast, to just feel like the person at the other end, they might be an expert in this or that, but they're also a human being. And sometimes just those little peeks you get into their life or their story or their vulnerability. To me, I just think that's what really forges that connection. So it was fun to do it. And I was really proud of myself because, as I said, I could never have done that, in the very beginning.
Yeah. And I think that this is such a teachable moment too, because like when you were talking about being vulnerable and sharing, parts of your story that would have been hard in episode 1, it probably would have been hard for your listeners to hear too, because they're like, okay, Karen, she's going in this deep stuff. I don't even know who she is. Like, who is this person? So I think that it was the right move. But I do see this a lot where people will say, okay, episode 1, it's like ripping off the Band-Aid. Like I just got to share the most vulnerable things that I've ever shared in my life. Like it's a therapy session for them basically. And I'm like, oh no. Those are the things that you record. And then you delete that one. It's kind of like writing like the journal technique. They say, okay, write it down, write a letter to someone and then set it on fire or whatever, like just get rid of it. So I think that was a perfect choice for that. But I absolutely agree with you. Those connections where you can share parts of your story where your audience is like, that's where I see myself. Like I see myself in Karen or parts of her story or these little nuggets of the things that you're sharing about your life. And again, and I've said this multiple times on the podcast, it doesn't have to be your social security number or where you live or intimate details about your life. But do you think that there's one specific thing that you've been able to share to your audience and you've actually had people reach out and say, this was life-changing, or this helped me so much? Have you had any of those instances happen yet?
Well, I have so many women reach out to me who are just feeling terrible, and that's where I really get it because, I always say Mother Nature has a sense of humor. So I started my journey into perimenopause the very year that I got divorced and ended a 24-year marriage. It was like my life became this tornado. It felt like I was going through a tornado. And women don't even know where to begin. When you're feeling that terrible and that part of it is emotional and part of it is physical, you don't even know what to do first. And so I think hearing that somebody was in that place and got out of it, hearing that it's possible, that there are tools that can help women lift themselves out of that really dark place where you're just depleted physically and emotionally. I think, that those messages are just hopeful for that woman who's really suffering and struggling. And unfortunately, there are many, many women out there who are suffering and struggling and need that information. And the funniest part of my whole podcasting journey was that the podcast launched in January. And in March, I get a letter from Apple saying, congratulations, you've made it to the top 50 midlife podcasts. And, in my mind, I'm like, oh, okay, I must be like number 50 of 51 podcasts. It was so new that I couldn't have imagined that it took. And when I opened it up, I was number 9. My podcast had gone in a matter of 2 months to number 9 on the list. What that told me is that there are more women like that out there than I even, ever could have imagined. The fact that I think people, maybe found my story relatable, maybe found my story hopeful, maybe, found me clear and informative, whatever it was. I think, it told me like, wow, there's a really big audience out there for this kind of information.
Yeah. And this is so key. So for anybody that's listening, like I want to go back to what Karen just said, because having your content accessible in the right places where people are looking, it's such a simple, overlooked concept. It really is, because people will come to me and say, gosh, like people aren't finding my content, or they're not, like my audience is not out there. I thought that they were going to be out there and they're just not. And this is a perfect example of, because I didn't even know that there was a midlife category. Is that under health and fitness? Where is that located? Because they just,
I have no idea either.
Categories. Okay.
Yeah. So, I honestly, I had no idea that was a category until I got that email.
Yes. No, this is fantastic to know, because it's a constant evolution. The way that podcasting keeps evolving, because it used to be, I want to say there were like 5 or 6 categories, like when everything first started. And as they keep evolving and they keep changing, I think it's so important to be very cognizant of where your podcast, where your content lies, because I bet that there were people that found your show because they were looking specifically at that category. And now that doesn't translate to all content, because I know there's a lot of people listening. They're like, I want to have a marketing podcast. And I'm like, so do like 10,000 other people. But if your content speaks specifically to an audience like Karen's, then I think that it's like, it is worth sitting down and investing. Like, where does my content belong? Where are people going to be looking for, other similar content podcasts that are built for them? They were made for them. So I love that. And congratulations. I hope that you share that all over the place, because that's fantastic. That's
Thank you.
than I've ever gotten in any. I'm jealous. Okay.
It was so exciting.
So fun. So fun. But I want to go back to your audience and your listeners and hearing back from them, because this is a common theme that I'm seeing right now with people that have recently launched their podcast. And they're like, well, Crystal, you say to reach out and survey your audience or get feedback from them, but I feel like it's crickets. Like, I don't hear anything from anybody. I see that, there's a few downloads, but how do I actually engage with the people listening to my show? So I'm curious if you have any advice for someone that is listening, that is just getting their show started. Like, if you could go back to your episode 1, day 1, when you launched, is there something that you have seen success with in getting engagement with your listeners?
What's been interesting to me is, and again, I was coming from a blogging background, so this was all new to me, and I kind of approached all of it like an experiment. That's why I have, I tried podcasts on style and beauty and all different kinds of topics, because I didn't exactly know what was going to hit with people. Funny enough, the beauty and the style episodes are some of my most listened to episodes, which you wouldn't think, for someone who's primarily health and wellness. So I don't exactly know. I think one of the things that has been a little bit of a frustration is that I don't know that podcast audiences cross over so easily to email lists or to social media. The fact that I have, my podcast following, the fact that it's so much larger than my social media following has been really interesting to me.
Yeah.
And I think, because it is still fairly new, I am, watching those things and kind of trying to see patterns and stuff. But I feel like podcast audiences are remain very much within that medium. And it can sometimes be deceiving. I think sometimes you'll look at somebody's social media following and say, oh, well, they don't seem that big. But, I just think the audiences seem to be very separate. And I think that's been, so that's sort of a goal of mine, is to now try to move, some of my podcast listeners over onto, connect with me on social media or jump onto my email list, that kind of thing, because there is a lot of other content that I'm offering on those other platforms. But it's just, I guess a matter of educating the podcast listeners about what they can find in these other places.
This is so interesting. And I'm so glad you brought this up, because I think you're the first person I've ever met that has that, like, you have like such a loyal podcast following. Because typically what I will see is people start on Instagram, they start on a blog, they start with their email list, and then they launch their podcast. And then they're like, how do I grow my podcast? How do I keep it going? But as you were saying that, I was thinking about my own listening habits. So I think about some of the shows that I listen to that aren't business related, that are lifestyle, or they are just like for health and wellness. And most of the time I'm listening because it's like, self-improvement, or it's, self-help. It's like leadership. It's just other things where I am purely listening for the information, for the content. And even if they do mention something that is email related or follow me here, I kind of selfishly am like, but I like you here in this little box, like this little intimate space that we've created with the podcast. So I want to, again, celebrate what you've created, because I think that that's fantastic that you have that little bubble for your podcast listeners to hang out and really hear those intimate details of everything you're sharing. But that's really interesting that I don't think that I've met another podcaster that has had that experience. People are typically like, No, I got to grow my podcast. I got to grow my podcast. So I love hearing
Right.
the other transition. So I think you can get there though. Like I'm super confident you can get them to come over.
Yeah, no, they're coming. And in fact, one thing that's been really helpful is, because a lot of what I share is maybe a little complex if it's a health related topic, and someone might be in their
Yes.
car and not able to take notes. So, often I try to have information sheets or, what I call cheat sheets that they can download. And that's definitely been, a great way to just introduce people to my website and the other resources that I have. So it's definitely happening, but it's slower than I would have expected, only because I think, as I said, people just like listening, and I think it's so much easier to consume a podcast than to jump on a website and start looking up blog posts, or to go to YouTube and start listening to videos. It's because you don't have to, because you can do it, you can consume it while you're doing other things. I just think people get really comfortable there. And I'm like you. I mean, I most of the podcasters who I follow, I don't necessarily follow them in other places either. It just feels like this nice little relationship we have
It's
over
so funny.
over the podcast.
I know, it's so interesting. And I feel like a podcast listener is like, we're stubborn. Like I don't know about you, but people will tell me about this new app, even as someone in the industry, they're like, oh, I love this podcast app. You should go download it. And or you should go to Spotify, or you should go to Apple, or you should go to this. And I'll hear all these things. And I'm like, I do my own thing when it comes to my podcast. Don't try to mess up my podcast.
Right.
But I think that's what's so beautiful about it is, and I would love to hear your perspective too on this, but I feel like I have this cadence with my podcast that I listen to. I'm like, okay, on Mondays, I got this one episode.
Mm-hmm.
Tuesdays, I got this one. Wednesday, no, like they release every other week, so I don't have to listen to that. But I mean, it is literally baked into my routine, which is the goal, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is the goal of so many podcast hosts. They want that to happen. But I'm curious if that's kind of how your listening habits are.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. Definitely. I'm a creature of habit in just about every sense, which is, maybe why, as you said, we get a little stubborn. Like for me, it's all about what's easy. I just, there's a sense of ease that I really enjoy. So the same way that listening to a podcast feels easy to me, doing certain things within the context of my own podcast, certain routines I have and rituals I have are easy for me. I think it just becomes kind of routine and almost like these little rituals. But yes, I look and some, I really look forward. Like there are some podcasts I listen to where I really look forward to, like, oh, Wednesday, there'll be a new episode of this or that. You do. I do just feel very connected to the podcasts that I listen to. So I totally get why, that audience is there and why they tend to stay there. I think it's just such a great medium. I think it's just such a more personal experience than a lot of, the other ways that people can connect. They're certainly not getting a sense of me in the same way on my Instagram account. Right. There's that barrier where podcasting, you really feel like someone's in your ear and they're just talking to you. It's like we're sitting across from each other in my living room or something.
Exactly. And it's like such a different experience if you're listening to someone for 30 minutes versus a 30-second, reel or just an image on Instagram. It totally just deepens that. This is what I love about podcasting is that connection can just be established so much faster, especially, because now people are going to go listen to Karen's podcast. Actually, we haven't even, what is the name of your show? We haven't even said the name of your show.
The show, I almost brought it up before when we were talking about, when you were talking about, how people can get the names out. Because this, I made a change. Originally, it was called the Wellegant Woman podcast. Now, my website is Wellegant Woman. And it joins together, these two ideas of wellness and elegance, which for me, obviously wellness, we all know what that means. But elegance, I think of simplicity, discernment, valuing quality over quantity. So I thought, okay, Wellegant Woman is perfect. But what I did after the fact was I went back in and I made it Wellegant Woman Redefining Midlife, because I really wanted that midlife piece to be obvious to someone who was searching for a podcast. Wellegant Woman, while it may be a great title, it doesn't really clue people into what the show is about. But when you hear redefining midlife, they can get more of a sense of what it is. So I'm sure that also helped the people who were looking for a podcast, the women in that demographic. I'm sure that also kind of helped them to find it.
I have to know, when did you change the name? How far into it were you like, oh, I need to add this tagline to it?
Not too far in. It was within the first, I want to say, like maybe 6 or 7 episodes.
Okay. Well,
yeah.
It's super key, because like there's a lot of people that come into my audience and they're like, I picked this name, I got to die with it. And I'm like, oh my gosh, no, you don't. Like, I've rebranded, Karen's telling, her story of rebranding, and we have so many examples of this. So I really wanted to key in on that piece, because especially, I think that I agree with you. It probably made all the difference, because it is immediately, I know, just adding those 2 words onto the title, I know, exactly. I'm thinking of women in my life that I can say, she would be great for this podcast. She needs to listen to it. And when you can identify the audience very quickly like that, it's so much easier to market it. So this is what I wanted to ask you next is, how has that been on your journey? Because you're a life coach too. So I'm assuming that you help the people that would be in your audience. So how has that been marketing your podcast or marketing your business on the podcast? Is that something that you kind of blur those lines together, or is it like something that you're still figuring out?
When I was trying to really get my footing with the podcast, I really didn't market too much of, my coaching or my programs or much else. I was really just trying to establish a connection with my audience. And I kind of in the beginning was afraid that maybe by coming in with a lot of marketing, it just would be a little harder. I tend to be kind of a soft personality, and I wanted people to just get to know me without feeling like right off the bat I was starting to market. So it took me a while before I started mentioning, my one-on-one coaching or my coaching programs or even my lead magnets. And then I started doing that. But again, I do it in a soft way. I feel podcasting just feels like a sacred space to me. So I'm careful about I try to be careful about not over marketing on the podcast. Because I don't always appreciate that when I'm listening to somebody and I feel like, they're marketing at the beginning and there's a break in the middle and they're marketing at the end. I kind of feel like it disrupts the flow a little bit for me as a listener. So I just prefer, not to do too much of that. Now, on the other hand, I do want to introduce my audience to my work and to the other ways that I might be able to help them. So, as time's gone on, I've done a little bit more of that. And right now I'm running a free workshop and I have a course that I'm launching. So, of course, my podcast listeners will be, privy to all that information.
Yeah, but I think that it's such a great approach, because I totally agree with you. I think it's like a little harsh if you turn something on and again, it's kind of like telling your whole vulnerable personal story right from the beginning. It's like, whoa. Like, we don't have a connection yet. But even if I find a podcast and I stumble upon it and I go back to the beginning, or I listen to their last few episodes and I'm like, man, this person is giving me so much value. Like, this is incredible. Then I have a different, I guess it's kind of like the first impression, right? If you're meeting somebody for the first time, if you come on a little too strong, it's like, whoa, okay, nope, oh, sorry, my phone rang, I have to go. You're like, do it. Oh, yes, honey, I'm coming. Like, whatever the thing is to get you out of there as quickly as possible. But whenever, you're listening to a podcast, I've binge listened to people's episodes. I just find them and I'm like, I want to buy everything that they've ever sold, because where has this person been my whole life? Like, this is exactly what I'm looking for. So I think that that's a beautiful mix of how you can slowly introduce yourself, your offerings, everything to your audience. And I love that it's been an evolution for you. And I can't wait to see where that goes. I think
Thank you. And you know, the other piece of it is that I think people can hear, you know, when you're excited about what you know, I know when I'm talking about this workshop that I have coming up or my new program that I'm launching in September, like there's really a sense of excitement. And I think that, you know, what's great is that when you read something, you just don't get that when it's not the same as when you're listening to somebody talk about something and they're like, oh my God, this is great. You know, this will really transform the way you do X, Y, and Z. And here's what I'm offering. And, you know, so I much prefer to have that in that sort of conversational format than to be sending it out. And of course, you know, as entrepreneurs, we do all the things. We send it out in the newsletter, we post it on social media. But I do think there's something really special about hearing somebody talk about it as opposed to reading something about it, you know, in a newsletter or on social.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it's one, you come off so much more authentic when, I mean, for anybody that's listening, if you need to script yourself, that's awesome. Like I had to script myself whenever I sometimes still try to script myself, but to your point, I feel awkward and weird if I read it and it's like, I sound like a robot. Like I don't want to do that one, but I love that you come to it with an approach of what works best for you. And I think that that's really like, I mean, one of the themes of today is, you know, the first is you're creating the content that I'm sure you wish that you would have had, you know, at the very beginning of your own journey. And then you're going with the flow of what feels right for you. And I'm thinking about, okay, you just hit 30 episodes. Like I want to say congratulations again, because it is big. It's a big thing, but I want to like fast forward you to, because you said you launched in January, right? Like January 2023. So imagine it's January 2024. What is the thing that you would be so proud? Like not numbers, not stats, none of those things, but what's like the big thing that you're like, man, I just want to accomplish this one thing. And I would feel so proud for my first year of podcasting.
That's a tough question. You know, I'm really loving just the people I've met podcasting and the people that I've interviewed with on their podcasts and the ones who are coming on mine. So I think really just expanding, you know, my little circle, my professional circle. I think that's been so fun. And I've spoken on podcasts that are, you know, this month I'm speaking I'm presenting at a summit that's style. And then I presented at, you know, a summit that was loving life after divorce. So it's like, I feel like, you know, it's just taken me in such interesting circles. You know, I've had the opportunity to meet such interesting people. So I think, you know, if I really expanded that circle, and I think that's what's inspired me the most is just like the people I've connected to through the podcast. So I guess January 2024, I would love to just expand that kind of professional circle and do more of those collaborations. Those have been really fun for me.
Yeah, I love that you said that because I think that whenever we look at our network and the different people that we interact with, I mean, this has been an incredible conversation and it's not like it's 5 minutes or 2 minutes. Like it is, you know, the ability to make a deep connection. Like I said, now I know about Karen's podcast and you can bet your bottom dollar if I, you know someone that I'm like, oh my gosh, you have to go check out this podcast. And what I will do a lot whenever I meet people is I will refer them. I'll be like, oh my gosh, you'd be perfect for Karen's podcast. Send her an email and say, Crystal Proffitt sent me, you know, like, hey, like, you know, Crystal said that she knows you and she's been on, you know, you've been on her podcast and everything. And so it really does not just expand your network, but it exponentially expands your network, because when you find this niche of people that can really just help you understand your audience better or understand different subsegments. I love that you said, you know, there's style, there's divorce, there's all kinds of living well and fitness pieces to your content. you're not, it's like that niche down to like, what is the term? It's like niche down to blow up or something. It's like, that's how you really get so strategic. And so I think that you're well on your way to making that happen. And I'm super excited for you.
Thank you. I think wellness, I think what's been interesting too is that it really is the foundation of so many other things.
Yes.
So I think no matter whether it's a style podcast or a divorce podcast, or, I interviewed with someone who works with women in midlife who are making career changes.
Yes.
The bottom line is we're all needing to start from a foundation of wellness. So I think, as you said, it's a niche, but it's broad enough that it really can be applied in so many different areas. So I think that's why it's been so much fun for me. I really never imagined when I started the podcast that I would be, interviewed on a business podcast or interviewed on a style podcast. But it's highlighted for me that we, and when I say we, I mean women over 40, are everywhere in every circle.
Yes.
And we're connected to each other because there's a lot of things that, despite our different circumstances, are shared experiences.
100%.
So, that I think makes it easy to kind of cross over and have these kinds of conversations in these different arenas.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. You have little pockets of every single genre across all podcasting. And I'm excited about your topic because I think I haven't seen this specifically in the way that you're doing it. And I love whenever I can tuck like in the back of my head, like I said, as soon as I know someone that's looking for a podcast, I'm like, oh, this is the one you got to go check out. So now you're in my Rolodex of podcasts that I go and share with other people.
I love it. Thank you.
Yes, of course. Well, I want to transition into, we have some rapid fire questions that we always ask all of our guests. So are you up for those?
Sure.
Okay. So since you've been in your podcasting journey for a little bit now, right? A little over than half the year, what piece of advice would you give to a brand new podcaster or content creator?
I guess my advice would be to work in advance. I always try to have a cushion. I'm never recording the episode that's coming out that week. That would be entirely too stressful for me. So I plan in advance. I, outline and record and kind of batch them in advance. So I think, for someone who's busy, who's got a lot on their plate, that little cushion that you create, to me, is very comforting. If I have a crazy week and I don't get to, record something this week, that's okay. I know that I have something kind of in the queue.
Oh, that's so good. I love that. Okay. My next one is a 2-part question. So what is the dream podcast you would love to be on? And who is your dream podcast guest you'd love to interview?
So I really love Tamsin Fadal. And I think she was hugely inspiring to me when I got into the midlife space. So I think I would love to really either be on her podcast or have her on mine, just because I think she's sort of like one of the women at the forefront of this movement to, age powerfully and change this perception that we dream and build and grow until we're 40. And then from 40 on, we're like basically in decline.
Right. Exactly.
I think there's this movement to kind of change that narrative so that we look at the second half of life with that same sense of opportunity and vitality that we approach the first half. And I really feel like, she was kind of one of the big voices that inspired me, when I reached that stage of my own life. So,
and what's the name of her show? Is it just her name?
Tamsin Fadal. Yeah.
Okay. Perfect.
Yeah.
All right. We're going to link to that in the show notes for anybody that's curious. That's a great one. Okay. And then my last question is, do you consider yourself a perfectionist?
Yes, unfortunately. I'm much better than I used to be, but I definitely fight a lot of perfectionist tendencies. Yeah. I have to, you called me out on that one. I have to be honest.
Well, I'm curious, did that also kind of manifest itself in your blogging too? Or is that just something that you're like, it's something that's been around?
I think it's always been around. I think as I've gotten older, I've softened it, it's softened for me, but yeah, I mean, anytime I'm trying anything new, and the podcast was this huge new thing, it was like, that expression, better done than perfect.
Right.
I tell myself that all the time, just put it out there. It doesn't matter if you sounded a little awkward. It doesn't matter if, you didn't say that exactly right. I do, because otherwise I'd be re-recording and re-recording, all the time. Exactly. So yeah, I've had to embrace imperfection in a way that kind of doesn't come naturally to me.
This is so good. But you just gave someone listening such a gift, because I bet they have recorded and re-recorded themselves over and over and over again. And that's the thing that's keeping them from hitting publish. Mm-hmm. So if you heard that, like, go back and listen to Karen, because she just that was a mic drop moment of just hit done is better than perfect. Just hit publish and put it out there, and you'll be able to learn and grow and evolve with your audience. So I absolutely love that. Karen, where can everybody find you? I know that you were talking about, you have a workshop coming up and you have a free resource. Where can everybody learn more about that and about your resources that you have?
Sure. So my website is wellegantwoman.com. I have a number of free resources there. But one is the Midlife Glow Up Guide, 7 days to your healthiest, most radiant self. And it just runs through, for somebody who isn't feeling good, who maybe just wants to start putting a few simple, manageable changes in place to feel better. It's kind of a quick 7-day, clean up your diet, start moving, just in some very manageable ways. So that's my resource. And of course, I'm on, Instagram, and the podcast is called Wellegant Woman, Redefining Midlife. So they can listen there.
Perfect. Yeah. We're going to have a link to everything in the show notes. But Karen, thank you so much for coming on today. This was so much fun. And I do mean it from the bottom of my heart. I wish you the best of luck. I know you're going to do incredible things with your show. And I just appreciate you coming on and sharing your story.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been so much fun.